Welcome to the problem with the DCEU. And before I can go into the number of problems with the DCEU, let's cut to an ad break. Hey everyone, today's episode is brought to you by two sponsors, the first of which is Shortboxed. Shortboxed is an app for collectors by collectors. It's a way to get your graded comic books to add to your collection easily by going to their app and using it to help facilitate getting trustworthy partners to send you the proper graded comic books. But we're also doing this because they're doing their first ever convention down in LA. The link will be down below, but on May 7th, they're going to have their first ever event called Shortboxed Live. It's going to be at the Santa Clara Convention Center, and I'm here to tell you about Shortboxed and their convention. Both links will be down below. But today's episode is also brought to you by our long-running sponsor, Gamersupps. Gamersupps is a great energy drink brand. You buy yourself a tub, the tub has a powdered energy drink within it, and you put it into your water. I find it to be less chalky than its competitors, and I love the dosage of caffeine because it lets me measure it to add to my coffee for the day, so I can kind of have both because I'm a coffee fanatic, but I also love my Gamersupps. But they also run things such as the Waifu Cups and Waifu Brand. Basically, you get all kinds of crazy anime women on your shaker cups to put your crazy Gamersupps flavors into. So that's today's sponsors, Shortboxed and Gamersupps. Now let's get to the video. All right, so this video is going to be a bit weird because before this, I was able to take a character that I love and adore and give you one particular problem and make an entire video out of the one particular problem. When it came to the MCU, in my opinion, what I told you guys about there, the missing core character is the problem with the MCU. But the DCEU is different. You see, the DCEU, in my opinion, and this one is entirely my opinion, although the rest of them have also been, although some of you apparently thought I was speaking facts. Thank you, because I agree. But this one is entirely my opinion. The DCEU problem started with the beginning of the MCU, and a little bit before that. So basically, the DC, before the MCU, it was decided that the DC's characters, Batman and Superman, were just too big. That they shouldn't be in any kind of a crossover or shared universe. None of that should exist. Batman and Superman were so big that they were deemed to be their own franchises, wholeheartedly away from DC Comics. To this day, that is still a thing. I don't know if Dan can find it, but way back when it was announced that HBO Max and Discovery Plus would be merging, they put out like an image that showed what they deemed to be their franchises, things that could stand on their own. And in that is Superman and Batman, then DC. I think there's a few other DC characters that they deem to be able to hold a franchise on their own, but that's still an issue that WB has deemed. DC has also always been owned by WB for as long as many of you can remember, I should state. It's not a situation that happened like in the 2010s, like with Disney with Marvel. As far as most of us have known for the longevity of our lives, it's very much been WB or a form of WB. So that's why in the early days, we had the Batman movie, the Batman Returns, Batman Forever, Batman, George Clooney. When we had those movies, they were just solo. They never crossed over with Superman, and we never had anything going on. The same thing was going on with the Christopher Reeve movies. They were just deemed to be too powerful to need to cross over or even mention Bruce Wayne. So they were all standalone by themselves. Batman also gets a reboot every so often with them changing out the actor. It was deemed that Batman could be like a James Bond kind of character, that you could easily swap out Bruce Wayne and no one would really notice as long as the Batman was in a suit with a cowl. So that's why we had them change out. That's why we had Michael Keaton, Val Kilmer, George Clooney, and then Christian Bale. Christian Bale is the beginning of the MCU causing problems with the DCEU. Because they decided to do what they normally do. They gave Christopher Nolan the ability to do whatever he wanted with the Batman license, and the idea from Christopher Nolan was that nothing would cross over. Batman was going to be Batman, and it was going to be its own grounded version of Batman, and it would not exist in a larger scaling world. Now, when the first Dark Knight came out, that was 2005. So that was going on before the idea of a crossover, multi-connected movie franchise was a thing. Iron Man came out in 2008, and that started to cement the idea that we could do something with this. Now, WB saw what could be a promising idea, but the problem is it hadn't been tested yet, and what WB was doing worked. You can argue all you want that we wanted Batman and Superman together. You can argue all about that George, I forget his last name, I'm sure Dan will pull it up, but the terrible Justice League movie that never got made. But we can argue that we wanted this, but WB deemed it not needed. Batman could hold an entire franchise by himself. Why waste the potential by putting him on a Justice League when the Justice League could be a franchise? Iron Man came out and implied Captain America, something that WB had never done. But that was just a fun Easter egg. As we built towards the Avengers in 2012, people started to see that there was a potential money in crossing over these movies. But at this time, we didn't have Disney money. We weren't looking at Avengers billion-dollar box office. We were just looking at successful movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that were lightly crossing over. Dark Knight Rises came out in 2012, and that's when the Avengers also hit. Now, this was the beginning of what, if you follow our podcast channel, Sal likes to deem the problem era of $1 billion. Dark Knight Rises broke $1 billion. I think it just crossed the line, but it did get up there. But Avengers did $1.5 million. Around this time frame, we also had Man of Steel coming out. And Man of Steel came out in 2013. Now, Christopher Nolan's Batman wasn't allowed to be crossed over with anything else within the DC universe outside of like a fun Easter egg nod or mention. But when Avengers came out and it beat their solo Batman film, WB's first problem arose. They saw dollar signs, as many companies do when their competition does something that they aren't doing. So Man of Steel rolled out, and Man of Steel did okay. Man of Steel made $668 million off of what appears to be $400 million budget if you do what everyone likes to do for the math on everything. If you do all that, it's about $400 million budget. They made about $200 million. Cool. Profitable. But that's not $1 billion, is it? And the decision was to take Man of Steel and use it as the stepping stones for a cinematic universe. If Marvel can do this with characters you've never heard of, well then by golly, characters that should be franchises on their own should be able to break $2 billion. If we can make $1 billion on a Batman film and we can make $650 million easy on a Superman film, what if you put your hands together, my friend? It's like peanut butter and jelly, chocolate and peanut butter. Peanut butter and pickles if you're pregnant. Peanut butter goes with everything. I mean, you can put that stuff on anything and it tastes good. Don't look into that. Anyway, so the decision was to take the Man of Steel franchise and then go straight into a crossover universe. And this is where the Zack Snyder problem kind of came in. Now, before we get into this era of DCEU, I do want to say that I'm a fan of the Snyderverse. I am. I like the idea of it going in a different direction. Whether we liked it or hated it, you will never know because we never got to that point. But I was a fan of what Snyder was doing. But this is where the first part of our problems came in. So DC and WB had decided that this should easily be making $1 billion. Man of Steel can do, about $500,000 to $650 million. Batman can do $1 billion. This should be easily doing that. And it was decided that they were behind. They needed to fast track stuff. So instead of like rebooting Batman and then making a Batman universe that would then cross over with Superman, they figured we already have a Batman story. We already have The Dark Knight. That ended in 2012. We can't really start a new Batman trilogy this quickly. That's not how this works. We need to give it some time. And they didn't even waste time announcing it. So at San Diego 2013, right after Man of Steel came out, it was announced that Man of Steel was now, even though it wasn't intended to be, the beginning of the DCEU, the beginning of a cinematic universe. And that the first movie that would be a part of this DCEU would actually be Batman versus Superman. That they were going to be kind of remaking the Dark Knight, basically the original Dark Knight, where Batman fought against Superman, but in this new DCEU. We would get a brand new Batman, but he wouldn't get his own movies. And then they started like spouting off all these movies that we were going to be getting. That Zack Snyder was going from just headlining a single Superman movie into headlining the Justice League movie, and he would be using that to build out the entire cast and characters like Wonder Woman and Aquaman and Shazam and Cyborg. We're going to be getting solo movies to tie into a giant cinematic universe. But this is where our second problem came in. The Warner Brothers seeing billion-dollar dollar signs. They wanted $1 billion and more. And they wanted you to want to go see the rest of this DCEU, even though they missed one key factor of the MCU that made the MCU successful. They weren't building to the Avengers originally. That's why we have some continuity errors in the beginning compared to where things ended up going with the entire MCU. They weren't aiming for the Avengers. The Avengers is something that came out of these are succeeding. So why don't we make Avengers? It was always in the back of their minds, but if you look into the original stuff, when they made the original Iron Man, it was just, let's just make an Iron Man movie. That's where it started. WB decided to take a movie that wasn't originally the beginning of the DCEU, make it the DCEU, and then make the next movie not good. So the next movie was Batman vs. Superman. And I actually kind of like this movie, but there's a lot of problems with this movie, and we can't ignore that. And these problems are the same problems that Amazing Spider-Man 2 had, and apparently WB just never watched that movie like no one else did. So if you go back to Amazing Spider-Man 2, the big issue is that Sony decided that they were going to make a Spider-Man cinematic universe. And so in the middle of the Andrew Garfield second movie, they decided to make it basically a backdoor pilot promoting a Sinister Six movie and all other characters. I don't even remember at this point, but it was basically half trailer for movies that don't exist and then half Spider-Man movie. Batman vs. Superman decided to bring us in and introduce us to a brand new Batman, use this as his introduction into the DCEU, and then turn this bout against Batman and Superman into a giant teaser for the rest of the DCEU. If you don't remember, this is Wonder Woman's first appearance in the DCEU. It's also the first appearance of Flash, Cyborg, and Aquaman as folders with logos and symbols and names devised by LexCorp. It was also the return of Michael Shannon as Zod. It was also a cave troll from The Lord of the Rings wandered over to the set to become known as Doomsday. It was just a weird situation in which they just brought everything that they could possibly cram into the movie. I think the core story of Batman vs. Superman in that movie is great. And I love the cinematography, the fight sequences, the choreography, the dance moves they were doing. Boom, boom, boom. Anyway, I was enjoying a lot of it. But then like the "Is she with you" line for Wonder Woman, the looking through the folders made by LexCorp, the trying to wrap every character in the entire DCEU. And then to top off all of that, trying to turn a movie into a giant teaser for an entire universe, the movie didn't even break $900 million. Now, the supposed budget for this movie is $250 million to $300 million. A long time ago in cinema internet history, it was decided that in order to figure out the marketing budget for a movie, you need to double the cost of the original budget, and that'll give you a rough general estimate of what the movie actually cost, as opposed to what was only spent on actually making the movie. Using that estimate, we're looking at about $600 million was spent on Batman vs. Superman. But leaks internally stated that the marketing, due to everything they tried to change on this movie, was well beyond that. That they had spent almost $900 million between marketing and basically the movie itself. The problem is, even if we go off the numbers that we do have available to us, they only made $300 million, which to the rest of the world is, holy crap, that's incredible. You guys are hugely successful. But in WB's eyes, it didn't break $1 billion. And that was the second problem. Well, that's the first problem coming up again, because we have two problems that are really going on here. Zack Snyder was tasked with taking his single movie and turning it into an entire universe. And nobody approved what he wanted to do with it. They just said, Zack Snyder, do you want to be our Kevin Feige? And just let him run with it. And WB wanted $1 billion, which led into the next big issue. So because of the backlash to Batman vs. Superman, because regardless of it making almost $900 million, Batman vs. Superman was lambasted for poor writing, poor visuals, darkened tone, basically what people weren't expecting in a Batman vs. Superman movie. WB decided to get their hands involved in everything coming out of Zack Snyder's universe because they wanted to try and make things make $1 billion. If Zack Snyder couldn't make $1 billion with Batman vs. Superman, well, he ain't gonna make $1 billion with any of this. We need to get into it and fix it ourselves. And if everyone's wondering what my overall opinion of the Snyderverse was, I actually like the ideas of it, but I do agree that his darker tone and the change that he was going to make to the entire pantheon of DC characters should have happened after we had just a true-to-life, normal DC Comics stuff. But I don't think it was terrible. Anyway, Suicide Squad was next on the bill, and the David Ayer version got removed. Too dark, too gritty, we don't want it anymore. So WB started tampering with stuff going on in the DCEU to try and hit that $1 billion marker. Because if, the MCU can make the Guardians of the Galaxies a popular group of characters, why can't we make the Suicide Squad a popular group of characters? And Suicide Squad, with its marketing budget incorporated, is about $400 million, and it made $747 million. These movies are profitable. Like, it made money, but it wasn't enough for WB, so they got more involved. Wonder Woman came out and only made $822 million, which was another what the hell. But it was still, they made a ton of money, and they weren't happy with it. And this trend continued. And you could tell as every movie came out, WB was getting more and more involved, all the way to the point of the Justice League. Now, I'm not going to go super deep into what happened with the Justice League. There's a lot of different things that have supposedly happened. Supposedly, WB wanted to fire Zack Snyder at this point because other than Wonder Woman, they had deemed everything a failure. But at the same time, Zack Snyder had a passing within his family. So between everything going on, he basically stepped down and Joss Whedon took over. Joss Whedon came in and caused a number of issues, once again, supposedly on the set. Problems with Gal Gadot, problems with Ray Fisher, stuff like that. He also completely changed the tone of the movie, adding in more humor, more jokes, adding in a red overglassed tone, all that kind of things. All those kinds of things. I talk professionally, it's fine. But Justice League, the penultimate movie, only made $657 million against a budget of $300 million, which if we double is only $600 million. So it didn't make any money. Part of the problem, in my opinion, isn't even that it was the Joss Whedon cut, because I don't think your average moviegoer had any idea what was going on with the Zack Snyder situation. I've always said I don't know why they were promoting this movie without telling you that Superman is in it. Like, they were trying to make you believe Superman wasn't going to be in this movie. But his logo is literally on this terribly logoed poster that I'm going to link to Dan. It just looks terrible, but you're like half promoting him, half not. It was like a whole big... The marketing department didn't know what they wanted to do with this movie. That's just what it comes down to. At this point, it was, there was the public situation going on with Zack Snyder. Even the casual moviegoer, even if they weren't aware of what was going on, they still had to figure out what was going on. They had to go see the movie. Anyway, Justice League horribly underperformed. I mean, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, and Batman vs. Superman all beat Justice League. Then Aquaman came out and blew the doors off everything, but now we had no Zack Snyder. This enters into the third problem of what I have deemed the issues with the DCEU. Because for the entire period of 2013 to about 2018, we were chasing the billion-dollar marker, which their argument was Disney did it, and Disney was still doing it at this time, so why couldn't DC do it? Arguably, Batman and Superman are more recognizable than any of the Avengers before the MCU. The MCU's kind of elevated a lot of them up there, but no one knew who Iron Man and Captain America and Thor were before then. So now Zack Snyder's out. Zack Snyder was the second problem, not because Snyderverse wouldn't have worked, but because he was trying to hodgepodge a DCEU out of one movie and then rushing to the conclusions, which is probably dictated by WB wanting $1 billion. Most of the issues up to now are WB, because the third issue is also WB. Man, ADD trying to keep myself on track. Imagine talking to me at like a coffee shop. I'd be all over the place. Anyway, the third problem is that once Zack Snyder's universe was deemed a failure, WB wanted to ignore it ever happened. But they didn't want to ignore it ever happened. So they moved into a different direction. We're just not going to touch our title characters. Looking at this roster, from 2019 until now, nothing came out with recognizable characters other than Wonder Woman 84. So it was deemed at this point that they're just going to get directors to do their own things, and we may or may not link it into the DCEU. You know what? As a matter of fact, the DCEU doesn't exist anymore. So you can assume or not assume all you want. But we're still going to reference things within the DCEU. And that's the third problem that came up with the DCEU. They decided that, you know what, if we can't make an interconnected universe that breaks $1 billion, we'll just make solo movies. We'll try it the way that the MCU did, but now we've already wasted our money on Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash. So instead, we're going to give you Shazam, the Birds of Prey, and a new Suicide Squad. Enjoy. Like, what? Basically, instead of trying again, instead of repairing the damage, instead of bringing back Zack Snyder or just making a new universe, it was decided just make DC Universe movies. Link them, don't link them. We don't care anymore. We just need you to make money. Now, this was also on top of the AT&T deal, in which was driving a lot of these companies into bankruptcy, including WB. They were just losing money. I think the last thing on their plate was like, we need to interconnect. Like, they were just Just make money. Just make money. I don't care. Just make money. Look at Joker. Make a movie about the Joker, but don't put Batman in it and don't link it. Okay. There's no way that movie will be successful. You know what I mean. It's fine. But that's the third problem with the DCEU. There was no EU anymore. It was just DC movies. You know, like, just look at the situation with Black Adam and Shazam. It's all over the news right now that supposedly The Rock was trying to strong-arm DC into being his own pet project. That's why he didn't want Black Adam to fight Shazam. That's why he didn't want Shazam to be in Black Adam. That's why he didn't want to do any cameos. Why did we get to that point? Like, I get everyone's hate on The Rock for that. But The Rock doesn't own WB, and The Rock doesn't own DC. How did we get to that? How did that even happen? Okay? Think about that for a moment. We all like to crap on Wonder Woman 84, right? The plot's incoherent. It makes no sense. There's so much stuff going on it that doesn't line up with even the character of Wonder Woman. How did we get to that? How did no one look at the script for Wonder Woman 84 and look at the script for Wonder Woman and be like, well, this one's gold, and this one's what? And that's the issue with the DCEU on the third round. So they were chasing the $1 billion. They tried to get Zack Snyder to hodgepodge of DCEU together, and then didn't like because they didn't make $1 billion. So the third plan was just do whatever. Why? What are you doing? Who's in charge of this? And then on top of that, rumors are circulating that Hamada, the guy in charge of the WB and DCEU at this point, wants to do the Black Superman movie, wants to bring in brand new characters that are more diverse. I think he wanted to kill somebody at some point. Like, rumors are circulating that he wants to try and take what does exist in the DCEU and break all of that apart and then make a brand new DCEU with a brand new Superman, a brand new Batman, all these characters. And we still, going back to what I originally said about the Snyderverse, we still never just got Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman in a cohesive, happy-go-lucky, DC-branded universe. The Snyderverse was fine, but we needed a Justice League Unlimited cartoon version of the Justice League in the big screen before we could go into an Injustice-level evil Superman. We needed an Injustice League Unlimited version of the Justice League on the screen before we could introduce Val Zod, like the Black Superman. For those who don't know, Val Zod is traditionally the Black Superman. Although rumors were that they were just going to make Clark Kent black. But we never know. We'll never know now because that movie, as far as I know, just doesn't exist. But it might exist. Depends on who you talk to. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is chasing that $1 billion led to rushing the cohesiveness of the universe and then led to trying to do what worked before, which was solo DC movies that didn't interconnect. But none of that worked because you allowed Zack Snyder to start the Snyderverse and then you stopped it midway through. So now, as small of a minority as they are, you have a vocal minority of Snyderverse fans causing problems. On top of that, you now have your general moviegoer fan base that feels no cohesiveness in the DC universe. And because of that, they don't want to go watch a DC movie. It's the same problem that DC Comics dealt with at the end of Death Metal. When they lost Andy Dio and the plan of 5G, there was no plan in place for DC. So for 2 years, we as DC fans could feel a lack of cohesion, a lack of interconnectivity. It's exactly what I said in the MCU. It didn't exist in the comic books for DC for about 2 to 3 years. We're back there now, so if you're enjoying Dawn of DC, so am I, and it's incredible. But anyway, the movies were having the similar problem. No interconnectivity, no overarching plot line, no big bad, nothing. They just wanted to make DC movies to make $1 billion, and they couldn't do it. And so they just kept ruining it further and further and further. Everyone's asked me how I feel about the James Gunn thing versus the Snyderverse thing. And I actually am excited for the James Gunn thing. Because my argument is we need cohesion, we need to have interconnectivity, we need to have a storyline that weaves in between each and every movie and comic book. Comics need to be over here, and movies, but they both have to have the same thing going on. James Gunn gets me excited in more ways than one because he's going to connect things. He's going to make things seem like there's one big plot again. And while I'm sad that we've lost the Snyderverse has not been around since the Wonder Woman movie. And that's debatable because Zack Snyder wasn't directly involved in that anyway. The Snyderverse really hasn't been a thing since Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. After that, it's really just been what Snyder would have done. what he would have done, what he would have connected, what his overarching plot was. But it's not really gone any further. And it's been, 16 years since Justice League or something like that? Yeah, like 16 years. Not that quite that much. But it has been 7 years since Batman versus Superman. And it's been 6 years since the Justice League movie. At this point, WB just wants that $1 billion marker. Or, in my opinion, they need to accept $600 million as a success, because all of their movies broke that. If they just accepted that, we would have kept going. But that's the problem with the DCEU. WB's greedy, which has led to problems with Zack Snyder, problems with cohesion, problems across the board. So you know what? I was wrong at the beginning when I said there's multiple problems with the DCEU. The DCEU's problem's WB. So hopefully James Gunn can fix that. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I know I was a little bit more rambly than usual, but the DCEU is just such a spider web of problems. I was trying to touch on as much of it as I could without deep diving, because there's so much more problems that I didn't even touch on. Okay? But yeah, let me know what you guys think down below, what you think the problem with the DCEU is. And yeah, that's it. We'll be back next week with another problem with video. Let me know characters you want me to touch on, and if I can think of something, I'll touch on that character. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.